Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Podcast Coaching for Kingdom Entrepreneurs. I am your podcast coach, Kristen Chadwick, and I have the lovely Sarah Beisel with me today. And she is our resident Facebook group expert. And I am so excited to have her here today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Super excited to chat.
Yes. Oh, man. You are the expert that we need inside of our podcast membership because I feel like this question gets asked a lot about Facebook groups. But before we dive into those questions, and I'm going to just tee you up here a little bit, is here on Podcast Coaching, we really want to help podcasters who are Christian entrepreneurs. There's authors, there's coaches. We want to help create the atmosphere to cultivate kingdom impact. And I think one of the biggest questions is, how do I get those listeners that are listening to our podcast and create a community? And whether that's, email, we've talked about that a lot on our podcast, or it is through social media, and specifically Facebook groups. I know that that's such a desire on people's hearts, is that connection with their people.
Yeah.
And so you here today, Sarah, is such a gift for all of us because we all are longing to cultivate community. And I would love, because I know you have a cool story, knowing and following you for the last few months, about Facebook groups. So I'd love for you to share that story before we jump in to questions like, hey, my Facebook group is dead. What do I do? Or do I start a Facebook group? So jump into your story real quick and just share your own experience.
Yeah. So I started my Facebook group, I think in 2021 now. It's funny because I didn't actually intend to start it at that point. I was speaking to like my spiritual mentor at the time about just like business things, and I was like, man, I really feel like I need to start a Facebook group, but I think it's like a future thing. I don't feel like God's asking me to do this now. But I couldn't get it out of my head. Like for months and months, I was like, I need to start that Facebook group. Like it's just this thing. It would not leave my head. So I was like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, but let's dive in and see where it
Sounds
goes.
familiar.
So I started my Facebook group. I know, right? So many of us start in that same place. And I think that's so important, right? God asks us calls us to those community, like calls us to do community for a reason. And if it's on your heart, like that's a good sign that there's probably something really cool to come from that, both, for your business, but also for the impact and the connections that you can have. But anyway, so that's where I started, and I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing. So I was a copywriter at the time. So I was like trying to use my Facebook group to get copywriting clients, but I didn't really know how to do that. It was a mess. And, there was a lot of trial and error, but mostly error at that time. And that's okay.
That's okay.
we learn and we grow, and we improve things as we go. But for a while, like I really enjoyed my group, and I was, getting some good conversations, but I was not in any way making money from my group. It was kind of a mess, because people didn't really want what I had, or I wasn't able to communicate any of that properly. Like there was a lot of sales processes to learn at that point. But I got so frustrated with all of these things, and I was working with a business coach. That's a whole separate story. I won't get into that today, but I was working with a business coach at the time that was not a very good fit for me. And through that process, I basically decided that my group was no longer worth it. I was going to I gave it away to someone else. And I was like, I'm walking away from this group. This is not for me. This is not working. I'm just called to go somewhere else. Like I'm called to do something different. So off I went. I handed it over to someone else who was going to kind of take it over. And we're like, yep, okay, cool. Like, let's just agree to do this. And then anyway, months went by, and I was not succeeding in any of the new things that I was attempting to do. Good sign that I had made a mistake. But anyway, that's okay. And it worked out really well. Like you can tell, like God did not want me to leave that Facebook group behind, because when I went back to have a conversation with the person that I passed it on to, she was like, you know what, actually this is perfect, because I took this group on for you, but I really like don't feel like I'm supposed to have this, and I've just kind of been holding it. Like I don't really know what to do with it. So like take it back. I want you to have it back. And it was like, wow. Thanks, God. Thank you for redeeming this, because it was a mess. And so anyway, I like completely left it for 5 months, came back and was like, all right, now what? Like nobody's talking in here. Like they've been talking to someone else, but they don't even know who that person was. Like I've just vanished, and now I'm back, and nobody has an idea of what's going on. I've pivoted things in my business. So I'm like talking about things that nobody even cares about. Like it was a whole thing. And I had to figure out like, how do I basically bring a group. It would have been easier to start from scratch, to be perfectly honest, because you have all these people in there already that are not in there for the purposes that you're kind of taking the group forward from. So Yeah, there was a whole thing to navigate that, but we figured it out. I learned so much about like bringing a group back to life, about engagement, about quality content that people actually care about and participate in.
Yeah.
How to like bring people through a pivot and a transition, because I think that's something that's very common with a lot of entrepreneurs. We start groups and then we pivot, and now we're like, what do we do with this group? Do I start a new one? Do I give it up? Like, what do I do? Like, how do I move through that transition? So it was a really, really good learning experience from that perspective too. And it's funny because through this process is where my expertise into Facebook groups came from, because I didn't start out to be like, oh, I'll be a Facebook groups coach. Like, that's what I'm going to do for my business. Like, I kind of fell into it through the experiences that I've been through. And people kept asking me about Facebook groups, like, oh, how do you do this? How did this happen? Like, how are you making it work? And I'm like, well, let's get on a coaching call and I'll talk you through it. And that's that's kind of how I ended up where I am. So it's been like with so many things that God does, they're not always straightforward. They're not linear. Sometimes there's a lot of downs before you get the ups. Like it's how it goes sometimes, but it's really good to be able to look back on it now and see exactly why the whole thing ended up the way that it did, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that because it's such a great story of encouragement of like, my friend, it's okay. Like you can pivot. God can turn things around. He's got something even better in store. And I love how sensitive you were to his prompting of coming back to your group. And even though it didn't probably look exactly what you thought it was going to look when you pivoted back, uh, but the beauty in it is that you've learned so much, and now this is exactly what you do is you help people in that exact same situation. And whether it's starting a new one or pivoting or reviving, hitting the AEDs on the on the Facebook group. I just find that so beautiful how he redeems all of that. Okay, so as podcasters, we are, like I said at the beginning, I think our main objective is to get to know the people that we are called to serve. Can you speak to podcasters in particular about why Facebook groups are a great way to connect with your people? And then maybe a little bit more like pointed is for a podcaster, specifically, how do we get them into our group?
Yeah. So for the first question there, like obviously Facebook groups are a great place to connect with your audience in general, but I think even more so from coming from podcasting, because I have a podcast myself, and it's very one directional, right? Like I go in there, I record, I talk into my microphone that's sitting right here. I like look at it and imagine the person that I'm speaking to, and then off it goes into the world, and it's very disconnected. And I think it's great in some ways, right? There's so many benefits to that, but like we don't know who's sitting on the other end of the earbuds, right? We see the numbers tick up and that's about it. And it's like, okay, cool, there's someone there, or a handful of someones, but who are they? And so I think the Facebook group is such a great way to be able to connect with them, because even, you can have an Instagram page or a Facebook page or whatever, and people can follow along, but it's still not, it can be a little more two directional, but it's still not quite the same. It's they're following your content and then they leave a comment, and that's kind of about it. You can comment back a little bit, but it's not the same on like a page versus being able to create a community where you're like in a space with other people that are all working towards those same goals or all have those same shared values. And I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about community versus other social media pages, because you can have conversations in other places, but you don't always have that same kind of camaraderie in the sense that, everyone that listens to your podcast, for example, right, are people that are aspiring podcasters or are working on their podcast. And there's that kind of shared goal of, we want a podcast, or we're curious about podcasting, and we want to be able to speak that message that we have out to people. And so we get to come in a group, and there's, loads of other people that all have those exact same goals, and we can share ideas. We can, relate to each other. If someone's like, oh my goodness, like I got my first 100 downloads, you're like, amazing. You can all celebrate that together because you all understand the importance of that milestone. And it's something that's really beautiful, or it's really frustrating. Like, oh my gosh, my downloads are down. Like, what's going on? And you can all kind of share ideas. And it's not just you, Kristen, talking to your people. You obviously get to have that position of authority because you lead the group, but you get all these other people that get to come along and support and encourage and walk through this kind of journey together. And I think that's something that's really wonderful about Facebook groups compared to other other platforms. So like if you don't have a Facebook group yet, I highly encourage you have one for your podcasting community, because I think it's a really great addition and an enhancement, I suppose, to the things that you're talking about on your podcast. In terms of how to actually get people there, well, first of all, you have a leg up from a lot of people because you have a podcast and you have an audience that's already listening to you. And the easiest way, right, is to just put a CTA in your podcast that tells them, hey, come join the community, right? But you can experiment with lots of different ways. I think you have to remind people, first of all the time, remind them that you have a community. I don't think we talk often enough about directing people to different places, either different platforms or to our Facebook group, or even like our offers, getting into the sales things. Like you have to tell people pretty much every single time, or they just forget, they get distracted, they don't listen. Like it's okay, we're human, that's just how it goes. People are probably listening in their car. It's like, oh, they can't, in that episode, they're not going to Facebook right now, but maybe in the next episode when they're listening to it at home and they're like, oh, actually, like I can go that time. So you have to just constantly remind people to come into the community. But it's about making the community like it's the word my coach uses, which I just love, is a destination. I just think that's such a great way to visualize communities. It's a destination for people. So how do you it's all about like, how do you make people want to come there, not just for the sake of having it there, not just for the sake of being a number, but like what is happening in your community that makes it somewhere that's worth going to. So, continue the conversation from your podcast in the Facebook group. What does that look like? Is it going to be questions or discussions or events or challenges? Like there's so many ways that you can bring people and continue that conversation from your content on the podcast and just kind of smoothly transition it into your Facebook group. So they've got a reason to come over there and talk about the episode or ask questions or participate in like events or giveaways or fun things. So there's so many different things. Like like the ideas are endless. We could talk about them for hours.
Right.
But it's all about asking yourself that question of like, how do I make this group a place that someone actually wants to come spend time in? Yeah. What kind of things would my listeners want to participate in that would make them come from just listening with their earbuds into actually like active participation in that same content?
That's great. Yeah, I love that question of like, what kind of things would they want to participate in? Which kind of leads into the question of, are Facebook groups dead or are they dying? And if our Facebook group really is dying, I mean, that was pretty much why I contacted you originally, was like, Sarah, nobody responds to anything in my group. So if you were talking to me, and I love you podcast coach listeners, but we got to amp it up inside my Facebook group, and that's probably all on me. So I own it. So really selfishly, this is a coaching call for myself, but I think it's for a lot of my podcast members too, and listeners who, maybe they started a Facebook group in 2020. Fast forward a few years and it's like, oh man, I forgot about my Facebook group. So can you speak to that? I know you touched on it a little bit of like creating content and engagement in a way that they want to participate in, but how can we figure that out well?
Yeah. So I've been talking to my own group about this a lot because it's such a common question, right? Because life happens, things get in the way, we get distracted, we do like I did and just kind of walk off for a little while and then come back. Like there's so many reasons. And I think the first thing is obviously don't judge yourself or hold yourself to like too high of a standard. It's okay. Like it happens to all of us. Things do happen and it's okay. We talk all the time about how important consistency is, but sometimes it's okay. Things do just happen and we don't want to. I don't think it coming to it from a place of like being angry with yourself is never going to be helpful, because then you're going to feel really frustrated about the fact that you're like not where you want to be, even more so than you perhaps would be if you were not coming from that place. So I think that's like, it's just important to have that mindset of going into it. And I think it's also important, like as fun as it is to say like, oh, here's these things that'll suddenly magically change everything. It doesn't always happen like that. And it's not an overnight like flick the switch type of thing. And I think, at least for me, it was really helpful to know that like it's going to be a journey and there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. It's okay if there's little booms and then nothing and then booms and then nothing. I think just knowing that it can take a little bit of time. It doesn't always. Sometimes things do pick back up very quickly and that's exciting. But I think it's also okay to know that if it takes a little bit of time, you're not doing anything wrong.
Yes.
It sometimes does just take a little bit of time and consistency. And you have to be willing to give it the time and consistency to really get to where you want to go. So I think those two mindset things are really important to have in place before you actually think about how you're going to bring a group back to life, because otherwise you're just going to get frustrated and give up 2 months later because things are not going the way you want it to, right? And it's like, no, it's okay. It's okay. Just breathe. So don't get mad at yourself, and don't get frustrated if it doesn't happen straight away, because it will get there. Yeah. So in terms of like actually like what does it look like to try and bring a group back to life? I think the most important thing is that first of all, you have to just decide that it's going to happen, so that you then show up every single day like it's going to happen. Because we always talk, like one of the things that I love to like talk about with like my clients is about how to lead your Facebook group and how to step into like that real position of authority and leadership with your group in terms of the accountability, in terms of setting the right example and standard for your audience and your participants, those kinds of things. And I think that that's the thing that really is the key for bringing a group back to life. Like you cannot expect people to go into your group and participate if you are not also in your group participating. And I think that's something that, you know, I had to check with myself over the years as well, but it's something that I think we sometimes kind of forget. I think we put a lot of expectation on our audience to do things for us. It's not like we feel like they owe us, but sometimes it kind of feels that way. It's like, well, they're not engaging. I'm like, okay, but are you engaging? Like, what are you doing? You can't control them, but you can control you, you know? So it's like, if you're only posting 2 or 3 times a week in your group, that's not going to cut it, especially if you're trying to bring it back to life. Like you kind of need to go a little bit too heavy to begin with. I think that's one of the things that is really important. Like, if you really want to give it a big boost, then you have to go give it a big boost. Like instead of posting like once a day, post 2 or 3 times a day for like a month, just to kind of
just to see,
give it that boost. And then you can pull back. It's okay. Like it's like a launch season, right? Like kind of treat it like a launch season where you're going like 200% into what you're doing for a short season. Like obviously that's not necessarily sustainable every single month of your of the week, unless you have a team and people helping you. But, you know, for a month, could you do double what you would normally do for a couple of weeks to just give it a little bit of love, a little bit of extra love to kind of bring it back into a place of consistency in life, and people are going to see more things and then participate more, and it kind of spirals up from there, right? So I think those are really like important things to think about in terms and build into the strategy, is like show up the way that you want your people to show up, because if you're not setting that example, then what do they got to follow? They don't know how to participate unless you show them how you want them to participate. And then why not just go bigger for a whole month and just see what it's like. Treat it like a launch, a relaunch of your group. Go big, do some fun things, maybe host an event or some workshops or some extra lives or a challenge or do a giveaway. Like there's, again, all these things, there's so many things. Like any idea that you think of for something that would be fun for you and enjoyable for your audience, go for it. Do that. That's a really good way to kind of boost your engagement and bring things a little bit of fresh air if it's been feeling a little stale.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And I love that you emphasize too, it's not like you're going to do that for 6 months. It's for even just a couple weeks or a month, just sitting down and really devoting time. It reminds me of that quote of where our attention goes, it grows. And so it applies inside of our Facebook groups too, of like, if you want it to grow, then you got to give it some attention. And I will say on the other side, I know that there might be some pushback of like, oh, Sarah, I already have to remember to do a weekly newsletter and I got to post on Instagram and I got to do that. And like, so what, as far as like time, what would you say is actually the ideal time for someone to lead a Facebook group?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I know I feel that I have to check myself on that as well. It's like, oh my gosh, but isn't this just another thing? It's like, well, first of all, it is, but is it something that is worth the extra time? And how much time would it actually take to create extra? I think sometimes that's something that I think is going to be a much bigger task than it is. It's like, oh, this is actually an extra like 30 minutes a week. I can handle that, you know, or whatever it is when I break it down. So like, if you are feeling like, oh, gosh, like this is going to be too much, like post every single day in my Facebook group. It's like, first of all, breathe. You're going to be okay. Second of all, how much time would it actually take to create 7 pieces of content? Remembering that it doesn't need to be long. It's not like you're writing a blog post. A piece of content could be a question. Like how long it takes 30 seconds to write a question, you know? So I think just like break down the reality of what that actually looks like. can you batch it? It doesn't need to be something you do daily if that does not work for you either, right? There's there's ways to break it down and schedule things in your week. Also repurpose, like you do not need to create fresh stuff. If you're writing a newsletter, copy and paste that into your Facebook group. Why not? Or like copy paste it, tweak a little bit or take something out if you want to reserve something special for the email list or whatever. Like it's very easy to repurpose and adjust content so that you don't need to waste extra time creating something completely fresh. And that's the great thing about having that podcast is like your first place of like content creation as well, right? So like if you have a podcast episode on a Tuesday, like that's the day my podcast episodes go out. Okay, I've already got that idea. I've already got all this content. How can I then just repurpose that into content for the week, right? Can I ask a question about it? Can I basically write a 1, 2, 3 post about some of the topics that I talk about? Can I, challenge someone's perspective by saying something that's maybe a little triggering about the topic, like whatever it is that you're talking about that week? How can you break that down into content for the rest of the week or for at least a couple of those posts, right? So there's so much repurposing that you can do. So it doesn't become a burden to post every day, like when you approach your content from like that higher level perspective. So I think if that's something that you're not already doing just in terms of your content creation for whatever platforms you're currently using on social media, take that perspective, and it's going to help save you time regardless of whether you create a Facebook group or not. Like even if you're just posting on Instagram, like it'll save so much time and so much head energy, like mental energy. So good. But back to the time question, the ways that I help my clients with their groups, I can help them basically get it down to about 15 to 30 minutes every day, give or take, depending on exactly how they're creating the content, when that fits into it. Personally, I take about 30 minutes every day for my entire Facebook strategy. And that's not just the stuff for like my own group. That's also including like the things that I do to grow my group, to go network and stuff as well. Yeah. So it's really not something that needs to be particularly time consuming. It's again, one of those things, if you want to give it more time, you absolutely can. Maybe things will happen faster, just like we were talking about with like a launch mode in your group, like going really hard for 1 month. Like if you have capacity to do that every month, right? You could, but it's not necessary for the kind of maintenance of a group. Really, it can be done in 15 to 30 minutes a day, which is great.
Yes, totally. And that feels so doable compared to like, have to sit down for hours and And so here's a practical question with that. So say you pose a question and you get nothing, like there's no response. So would you, as the Facebook group leader, would you answer that question in the comments, or would you?
You can do. I mean, sometimes, so a lot of the time I have a team that helped me do my Facebook group at this point. And so a lot of the content they are creating. So for me, I go and answer some of that, like, because like they're creating the questions. I'm like, this is great. Like I didn't even write this question, so I can answer it like a normal human being, which is kind of fun. You can, I think it's not ever a bad thing to interact the way that you would want other people to interact, because it gives them an example of how to participate, right? It's one of the things that I help inside of my program, is like, how do you actually teach people how to participate in your group? And so it is like writing the kinds of posts that they're allowed to see, that they could post themselves, asking them to do that. Right. Go ahead and answer your own questions. There's never any harm in that, especially if it's a discussion, right? If it's something that's there for like not market research, as an example, like if it's something that you want to have a conversation around, like, are Facebook groups dead, is a good question. Like I could ask that in my group, right? And I could go into the comments and be like, well, I don't think they're dead, and here's why. So it gives people some more insight into how I think about the problem and the question. I personally wouldn't do it straight away, because I don't want people to like think that they can't then provide their own opinions. I think sometimes if people see like the host or the leader doing something in their group, they're like, oh, well, they've said their thing, like, I guess I can't participate in this anymore. So I think there's like that balance of just seeing what the personality of your own group is and what your culture is. It was actually something that someone had said to me about Facebook groups, which I think is, depending on the culture, sometimes it can be very true. It's like, if people ask a question in the group, don't let you be the first person to go and answer it, to try and encourage really other group members to kind of come and help. And again, sometimes like that works, sometimes it doesn't. So I kind of, it depends on the question. If it's a Facebook groups related question, I'm the first person to answer that, because I'm approving the post and I want to make sure that I answer it so that they know Like if they're going to come to me for Facebook group stuff, right? Like I want to be that first person to give them some suggestions. But if it's things that are not necessarily my first expertise, if it's a question about business related things or something totally different, because people come in there with questions all the time about different things. It's like, okay, who in the community can help with this? You know, is there someone that I know that I could tag? Is there someone that, you know, might have an idea and a suggestion? And so it's just about like, think about like, how do you interact in a Facebook group as a real human being?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the best place to start, you know?
That's great. Okay, here's another practical question is how do you feel about Facebook Lives? And I know a big announcement that just came out with Facebook saying that they're going to take down your videos after 30 days. And my own thoughts on that was, well, it's about time to start your podcast.
Well, exactly.
If you weren't already having a podcast. But I would love to hear the two questions there is like, how do you feel about Facebook Lives? Are they worth showing up in that capacity and how much? And how do you feel about the 30-day deleting?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I'm not bothered by it. I mean, because I think like their reasoning makes total sense. You know, they're looking at the statistics and the analytics of all that, right? And they're saying the reason that they're doing it, in case you're like, what are you talking about? Facebook is removing lives automatically after 30 days now. It used to be an option that you could choose. Now it's just a thing that will happen with all videos because they've noticed that after about 30 days, nobody looks at them anymore. They are certainly not showing them in the algorithm anymore. And especially if it's a live that's not within a group, like if it was just on your profile, it's gone. Like unless you're gonna scroll for days of your life, you're not gonna see anything that was posted a couple months ago. So it makes a lot of sense from a practical perspective. A little frustrating in the context of groups because there's so much strategy behind like essentially creating like a database of content within your group, which is now gonna be unfortunately something that can no longer happen. But again, I've been like, well, okay, podcast time. Why not? Like there's so much there. I think it's a great opportunity for building your email list as well, because instead of like people can come live, I think there's so much value in coming live. So to answer your first question, yes, Facebook Lives are amazing because people can actually interact with you in real time, which is something that is so important that just doesn't happen in any other context, right? Content doesn't get seen straight away, so that interaction is not happening in real time. Even if you're going back and forth in the comments, it's still very disjointed, right? You're not necessarily saying all the things that you want to say. It's not conversational. Whereas a live, it's still got a little bit of disjointedness because it's not a Zoom call. You're not face to face, but they can interact in real time with you. They can laugh and you can, you know, react back to like just like the things that are happening. And you can really build so much trust with people because they see you as a person. They get to see your face. They hear your voice. They get to listen to you, just like your thought process and your mannerism. And I think all of those things are so important for them coming to make a decision to come work with you, especially if you're a coach, like especially if you're in that coach course creator space. Like if you're not doing lives, you're missing a huge opportunity to build sales essentially, because people could still come and buy from you without it, but it's going to take them a lot longer to make that decision versus getting to like hop on live with you, answer some questions, have a conversation. And they're like, oh yeah, I could picture you as my coach. I could picture sitting down on Zoom with you. I hear your voice. It's not going to freak me out the next time I see it. Like, I know what this, like, and it's a weird thing, but like for me, I need to hear someone's voice before I could ever get on call with them. If I can't hear their voice, I kind of have this thing in my head, like, are we going to be able to talk properly? Like, what is this going to be? You know, like, I don't know what it is. A lot of people do that. We just want that familiarity, especially if we're going to pay money to someone to have them help us. Like, you want to know that you're going to get along and you can interact well. And so lives are such a good way to have that first step in the process for people so that they kind of know a little bit about your personality, your vibe, the kind of way that you talk. Are you going to be someone that's going to like push them? Or are you going to be like super chill? You know, what are you like as a person? Because they need to know that if they're going to come coach with you, you know? So yes, lives are still amazing. You should be doing them in your group. And it's a great way, coming back to that very first question about how to get people into your group. Like podcast content is great, but what if you could sit and listen to that podcast content in real time and ask a question? Like that's what a Facebook Live is. Like it's your podcast content in real time, which is so beautiful because then they can actually be like, oh, but I don't understand this, or oh, could you talk more about that? Oh, but what about in this context? Like you can have a conversation about it, which is amazing. And you know, you can choose how much to give away with all of that, right? Some of that will be reserved for your paid content. But then again, it's like, hey, come into my paid content, you'll get the answers to all these questions. So again, it's a way to sell that in a way that is more effective than just on a podcast, because you can't have that back and forth.
Yes. Oh, so true. Yeah. And how we all as podcasters crave that back and forth of
Yes.
like, please somebody ask me a question.
I just want to know you're hearing me.
Yes.
Am I making sense?
Yes.
And that's something else, right? Sometimes we say things because we're testing out our own ideas and they don't always make sense.
Yeah.
On a podcast, you don't get that. If it doesn't make sense, you're not going to know.
Right.
So I think sometimes we need that if we're talking about something in a new way. Like being able to do it live is so valuable, because then people can be
true.
like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make sense. And you're like, okay, what if I explain it this way? And then you're like, okay.
Yeah.
So if you're ever testing something, a Facebook Live is actually a great way to do that.
Oh man, I have so many questions about Facebook Live. Okay, I have so many. So one would be, if you do a Facebook Live and nobody shows up, what do you do?
You do it anyway. and then post about it. Like talk about it all the time. It's in the same way that if you're like doing your podcasts, like so my podcast goes out on Tuesday, right? You bet I'm talking about my podcast on Tuesday in the group anyway, right? I'm telling them,
Okay.
here's the episode. I'm asking them, did you listen to the episode? I've got a question about the topic. I'd be like, hey, I just did an episode on this, right? You're talking about that content.
Yeah.
You do the same thing with a live, right? Hey, I went live. Hey, did you catch the live? Hey, we're going to talk about this topic. Do you want to come along? Like you're just talking about it. I think content is not like especially if we have longer form content like a podcast, we kind of get in our heads that it's like a one and done thing, right? Like we put the episode out there and then it's out there and it just does its thing. Like that's fine. But content is not that way. It's kind of like it has to be a living, breathing thing. And we have to think about content as a whole rather than as like individual pieces of content, because
good.
otherwise it's like, okay, nobody's going to see one piece of content. So what? That's okay.
Yeah.
Post another piece of content. Say the same thing, say it in a slightly different way. Someone else will see that piece of content and that's
Yeah.
great, right? So few people see each piece of content, which is so frustrating. I wish that they would show it to a greater proportion of people. I don't know why that's the way it works, but so few people will ever see your content, like one individual piece of content.
Right.
That's okay. If you have 3 or 4 pieces of content about the same thing, then more people are going to see that topic. More people are going to be able to participate in that conversation through multiple pieces of content. So I
Okay.
think that we have to let go of the expectation that it's a once and done thing. Like the live is out there and now it's done. It's like, no, talk about it. How many posts could you make about that live? Could
Yeah.
you talk about it before? Talk about it just before. Talk about it after. Talk about it next week. Like,
Yeah.
just continue to talk about it and direct people to it.
Okay. All right. Well, so that leads into my second question, which is, do you recommend that it would always align with your podcast content for the week? Or do you recommend more like variety of a conversation? Like say you're talking about business growth on your podcast, but then maybe you come in and you talk about time management, or do you find that it connects better to your community when you're in the same genre, but just kind of hitting it at a different level?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to approach it, I suppose. So it just kind of depends on, I guess it depends on a lot of things. So for me, my lives become my podcast content. So I basically do it the other way
You do it
around.
the way-
So I
okay.
record my lives and then, a month or 2 months later, it becomes a podcast episode. So I'm not duplicating that content. I live it and then it goes into my workflow and then it gets produced into a podcast
Brilliant.
episode, because I just don't have time.
Yeah.
But another way to think about it is if let's say you're doing one podcast episode a week, could you just add that in as a second podcast episode a week and treat it like a new podcast episode, but do it as a Facebook Live? That's another way to do it. So that and then, you could air it on the podcast as a second episode a week if you wanted to as well. Like what's the harm in storing it there, especially now that the lives are going to be going away? Just anything that you do in your group, chuck it on your podcast.
Yes.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
That way it can live on and people can go find it and you get all the SEO benefits and all the things that you know about with podcasting, right? So
Yeah.
that's one way to think about it. You could just treat it as a second podcast episode if you wanted it to be something different, in which case you just create it and create the content or the ideas in the same way that you would come up with your first podcast episodes, whether it's the same, something totally different, like whatever your creation process is for that, you would just do that for the episodes. And then the third option, I suppose, is to have it be a kind of add on to that episode. So you could do your podcast content for the week and then have like a conversational style live talking about it, or having a Q&A session, or a continuation, like a part 2. Like it really depends on how you want to approach the creation, whether you want to just not duplicate, like repurpose one into the other,
Right.
or have it be an extension, or just again treat it like a whole new piece of content. Like it just totally depends on what you want to do, how much time you have to create, and yeah, what you feel like, really.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, it's creative license, which is
Yeah.
why we as content creators are here is to decide what works for us and our people, and I'm sure looking at analytics and all of that and kind of seeing what is more I would say like evidence base of like, oh,
Yeah.
you know what? They really enjoy when I create a brand new topic versus I'm just going
Yeah.
to go right off of what I said on my podcast or vice versa, or recording my podcast while we're doing the live. And
Yeah.
the lucky people that get to be in community while I'm talking about it, it's to their benefit. So that's so good. Okay, so here's another question. And this is more of like content specific. And you had mentioned earlier, like inviting them more into the paid aspect. So, what's your experience with Facebook groups and monetization and kind of drawing that line of like what's too much content or is there too much content given before you say, hey, you know what, you can come inside my paid community and get deeper here?
Yes. So such a good question. I think it's like, I feel like this is the struggle for every single person. Like, where's the boundary between the free stuff and the paid stuff? How does it work? The way that I like to think about content creation is that everything that goes out is its purpose is to direct people to come work with me, right? Like that's
Yeah.
my goal as a business owner, is to bring people into my paid stuff, right? So everything, that's not to say that it's not ever helping them do things, right? But the goal of pretty much everything is to, in some way, direct them towards me. So whether that's something about like a story about myself so that they can get to know me as a person and know that I'm the right person to coach them, or not the right person to coach them. Like I want them to know
Yeah.
which side of the line they fall on, right? So, or maybe it's, something about the value of Facebook groups, helping do that nurturing piece, right? So that they know, am I going to create a Facebook group? Am I not? Like, I need to make that decision. Like, great, that's going to help you. Helping them actually understand that like my program is worth purchasing, is worth investing in, right? Like helping all of these things. So like the strategy of the content is to guide people towards you in some way or another. So if it's to promote the podcast, that's helping bring people towards you. If it's to promote your actual program or your course or whatever, great, that's towards you. Even the nurturing, everything is bringing them a little bit along like that kind of buyer journey,
Yeah.
so that they're coming closer to work with you. So that's the mindset that I have. So my content is not particularly educational. And I think that it's really important because like there's obviously like there is some amount of education in there in terms of we're helping reframe people's minds on things. We're helping them challenge a perspective or something that they are maybe being really stubborn about, or something that they can't get past, something that's keeping them stuck. And I think that's like when we get into content creation from that perspective, where we're really thinking about like, how do we help someone move towards making a decision? Whether the decision is yes or no is irrelevant, right? That's not, we're not here to force people to purchase. We're here to help them go, yes, I want this. No, I don't need this, right? Like that's really what you want them to be able to say. So how's your content helping them do that, right?
Yeah.
So is it, sometimes that is educational. Sometimes it is like you need to just give them a quick tip about something,
Yeah.
because they don't really know what to do with it. But a lot of times it's like, it's your content is doing a lot of mindset work for them, and it kind of
Okay.
needs to do, like, that's how I approach it. Like they need to start thinking about things differently so that they know, like, first of all, they know they can do it. Like they can fix their problems. It's possible. I think
Yes.
sometimes people get really stuck on thinking like, am I ever going to be able to do this thing? Like, yes, you can. If you want to, you can. Like, let's think about it. But that's really what the content needs to do,
Okay.
is connect with them in a way that helps them sort through their own head how to move forwards. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes that will be tips, but most of the time it's like helping them understand, like, you're stuck. This is why you're stuck. This is the places that are causing you to be stuck, and this is what you do about it.
Yeah.
What you do about it is this concept, but the details of that concept I can teach you, or I can help you with. Like, come work with me and I'll walk you through the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
That's good. Okay. Yeah. Man, this has been so helpful. It's been I mean, I just want to like keep asking you questions, which I know
I
that
feel like we could talk for hours because there is so much to it,
I
right?
know there really is. And I love that you're going to be, speaking of coming inside of a paid something, we have our podcast membership, which is for Kingdom podcasters who are like minded. We're all hungry to serve Jesus and to love people through our podcast. And Sarah is going to be one of our guest experts this month in our pod class, is what we call it. And basically, what that is our training. It's just we get to sit down with Sarah and ask those personal podcast questions for our Facebook groups, and we get to pick her brain, which is amazing and such
great.
a gift. Such a gift. So if you're interested in jumping inside of our membership and experiencing some really personalized coaching and workshopping on your own Facebook group, I encourage you to come into our membership this month and experience that. And also you get 2 hours of group coaching with other podcasters and myself. And we get to encourage one another in this journey. So, I do invite you into that space to really get deep into your own questions for your Facebook group. And as you can see, Sarah is like the bomb diggity with Facebook groups, and we could ask her questions for hours. So thank you so much, Sarah,
I'll
for
get a
being
big
here.
cup of coffee before so that I'm ready to go.
You'll be like, oh my gosh, so many questions. So I just appreciate your time, Sarah, asking or answering so many questions, and you provide so much value. You guys, if you don't know where her Facebook group is, I'm going to plug it down below in the show notes, and just join that group. She offers so much value, and she really is as amazing as she is on this podcast conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.
It'll be so much fun to connect with anyone that wants to. I love it.
Awesome. Well, all right, you guys, I love you guys, and I am cheering you on, and I hope this was an encouragement as much as it was to me. And we bless you, and happy podcasting.